From vinyl sounds to lively verbal go-arounds, this is Into the Runout. And we welcome you to our second podcast. For those of you who are watching this today, you will have noticed from podcast number 1 to podcast number 2 that there's a slightly different visual. We learned after the first podcast that there was some resolution issues with my camera I was using.
Yeah,
and
the kids today called that potato vision.
Oh.
That's kind of what it looks like if you use a potato as a camera. That's what it looks like.
Yeah,
but I think we've corrected that.
I think we have. I think I look far more clear. I don't look like I'm in a gray, fuzzy maze.
What's worse, a fuzzy maze or a purple haze?
Ooh, I don't know. Regardless, excuse me while I kiss the sky.
Hey, watch the copyright infringement.
So today, as a part of our second podcast, we are diving into a band which we referred to in podcast number 1. And of course, if there's any place to start in the world of music, it certainly owes an homage to one of the most iconic bands in the history of recorded music. And of course, that is the 4 boys from Liverpool, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, of course, known to the world as the Beatles. There's obviously an exhaustive, series of podcasts that we can do, but I think it's just appropriate that we just spend time today just kind of giving a basic overview of the boys and their impact.
Yep, sounds fair to me. It's a good place to start. And I'm sure it won't be the last time we talk about them.
Oh, no, we could devote whole shows to just, individual albums or what have you.
Yeah, or individual band members, whatever we want to do. And, in the future, here in a few years, they're going to be coming out with those 4 movies about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And they're supposedly going to release them all on the same date. So you're going to have to sit in the movie theater all day long. And then you get to choose. You get to choose what order you want to watch them in.
Wow.
It's all up to you. So maybe in the future we'll do some individual episodes. See how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I had my choice to start with who I would want to see first, I guess I probably would go with technically the first Beatle, which of course we can segue right into the history of the band. That of course would be Mr. John Lennon, because he was the guy founder of the Quarrymen and the band that played a form of what was known in England as skiffle, but it was also a form of emerging rock and roll that was happening because, of course, everybody in England was overtaken by the sounds of the music that came from the South and the sounds of Elvis, and so much of that R&B sound was certainly making its way into England. And I love the fact that, when the anthology came out in, 1995?
Yeah, I believe so, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was, of course, a great, depiction of the whole history of the band. But before that, us Beatle fanatics, we had, of course, our encyclopedia. Our reference point, of course, was the very underrated and quite forgotten documentary called The Complete Beatles, which was first seen more frequently on places like PBS, but eventually made its way into the video market. And it was narrated by the English actor Malcolm McDowell. And it was a very, very gritty, but very, very real, bare bones story of the Beatles. And I thought Malcolm did an impeccable job of narrating the story. And I thought the individuals who were behind the making of it did a great job, because they really, really laid a foundation of the music of the time. And they talked to people that were a part of that era, that were around at the same time as the Beatles, and who they were influenced by.
Right. And I bought the box set at the time, which had a complete collection of all the Beatles studio albums on CD. And then I did happen to capture that documentary. It may have been on PBS. I captured it on VHS, and I played that tape over and over again, and that's how I retained a lot of that early Beatles information. And
Yeah.
then when Anthology came out, I believe that was on ABC. I think that's where that aired, and I recorded all of that too. So a lot of study back in the early day before we had the interwebs in our grasp.
That's true. That's true. But I really loved the fact that, because England being, Liverpool being this very, very just, blue collar town that was just pretty much, you went to the mill, you worked, the next generation's aspirations were most likely not going to be any better than the previous generations. And out of this, little port town, emerged these young musicians. And what I thought was really neat in the original Complete Beatles was that, these were guys who eventually came together as the time progressed through various meetings and interactions, but they started out in the rawest form and over time honed and polished their sound through practice and through numerous trips to Hamburg, Germany, in which one of their fellow artists, Tony Sheridan, talked about that, it was a catalyst and a proving ground for those aspiring musicians. And if you had the skill, if you had the talent, if you had the perseverance, it would make you a better musician. And it ultimately did that for the Beatles.
Yeah, they roughed it, actually. I read quite a few books about that experience in Hamburg, Germany. They roughed it. They slept on cots, and I think at one point George got really ill and he had to go back home for a little bit, and they had to have someone come in and fill in for him for a little stay. So it was a rough go, but they just kind of meshed and glued and grew together as a complete 4-member group. Well, I guess some could say 5 if you're considering Stu too, and then.
Well, yeah, and I think Stuart Sutcliffe, of course, who John Lennon met in art school, he was certainly a significant part of that early time where he certainly meshed into the band dynamic. And I can only imagine that John, if he was around today, he would certainly say that Stu's involvement and influence in the band, despite not being musically polished because he was more artistic than anything, the guitar kind of served as more of a showpiece than a play piece. But still, his involvement in the band was still, it was that artistic expression of who he was that made the early version of the Beatles who they were.
Yep. Yeah, he was a big influence, even though he didn't have the music inclination, I guess. I believe he played the bass, but kind of faked it along the way.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Paul McCartney bass player up to those standards, but he brought on the mystique, I think, and the kind of toughness that the Beatles personified before meeting Brian Epstein.
Yeah. And I love how Brian came into the picture, because as we learned in the Complete Beatles, he was just managing the music section of his father's department store. And, had he not been so involved in that side of the business and having to make sure that side of the business was profitable, he would have never been motivated to seek out the Beatles, much as less in a place, what was it called? The Cavern, I believe?
Yeah, the Cavern Club?
The Cavern Club, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, his trip to the Cavern Club certainly wouldn't have been driven by his own need to partake of the Liverpool scene. He was going to see these young guys, and of course he was not only, wowed by their musical talent, but he said, I found them to be very charming, and that's what won me over.
Yeah, he was a big influence to them, to help them step apart, I guess, from all the other bands that were kind of taking on the same role, the tough guys with the leather jackets and the slick back hair. So he kind of set them apart as I guess you would call them the first boy band group. Yeah,
that's fair. And he certainly cleaned up the image. He got rid of the leather hard street look, and made him into something a little bit more presentable and distinct from the rest of that era of more rugged guys, which, they were just a product of their environment, so there was nothing wrong about it, but it certainly made them a little bit more distinct And as their sound became more polished, it's like, I remember in the, in the complete Beatles, the, once they got better, I think it was Malcolm that said something to the extent of, this was no longer, they were no longer the bums, they had become, polished musicians. And you could hear it in their more refined sound. They were finding their identity. Paul, of course, was playing bass. And, the transition had just gone from, or was going from, Pete Best being the drummer to Ringo. And that was after they, of course, met George Martin, who then was able to, get the Beatles together, determine, okay, what can you do? What are you capable of? And as George said, I was looking to see what voice stood out. And he said, why bother? Just let them be who they are. And, their voices will, express themselves. And
yep. And sometimes he gave them a little too much freedom in the studio, and they went off the rails a little bit. And, that kind of caused, I don't want to get too far ahead, but kind of caused a little, kind of caused it all to come crashing down at the end. And he kind of had to pull them back together to finish the last album. But
yes,
in my mind, George Martin is my fifth Beatle, the one I consider to be my fifth Beatle. So I don't know if you feel the same way.
Oh, I absolutely feel the same way. Because he really was that balancing dynamic, that true north that kept them all together as a cohesive group, even as they developed their own identities, their own styles, their own preferences. Even later, as the band kind of branched off in regards to the individuality that was happening, where, okay, George and Ringo would perform together a little bit more. Paul would just kind of do things with Ringo. John would be more with Ringo or George. And, having them all play together was becoming less of a reality until they ultimately, kind of tried to pick up the pieces of the Let It Be sessions and endeavor to do Abbey Road.
Yeah, and I think the problem with the Beatles, if it would be considered a good problem, I guess, is they all, once they started growing musically, they grew too fast. They all became great at their craft quickly. I think Paul was the most polished when it all started because he came from a musical family.
Yes.
John, he started with, I think George said in an interview he met him and he had 3 strings on his guitar, and he thought that's how it was supposed to be. So George had to show him how to string a guitar. And then George was, he was really good at the guitar at an early age, but I think he grew the most within the band as they were the Beatles, and then later on had an amazing solo career. And Ringo was an excellent drummer for his time, and arguably one of the best drummers of all time. One thing you can't do with Ringo, though, is you can't send him fan mail.
Really?
He's refusing fan mail. You haven't seen the YouTube video?
No.
Oh, it had to have been, I don't know, 15 years ago he sent this out. We'll post a link in our social media so people can check it out if they haven't seen it. But it's hilarious. I won't spoil it. We'll just post a link and everybody can check it out. It's funny.
That's funny.
Yeah, Ringo, I guess Ringo's been considered among his peers to have the best kept timing with the drums. And that was essential for the Beatles in the early years, especially in live performances, because they couldn't hear a thing that was going on with all the screaming and hollering from everybody in the stands. So all they could do is just, if they could hear him playing, that was one thing. But if they couldn't, they would just, watch his hands, and they would be able to stay in time just by doing that.
Yeah. And I love the old footage of the Beatles playing live or on the Ed Sullivan show in the various places. And you can tell, Ringo doesn't lack any confidence in his ability to keep in time and, and provide that necessary, percussion element that just brought the whole sound together.
Yep.
So obviously we've to kind of segue from Ringo, let's take the ship back a little bit to the moment when everything started to change for the Beatles. It was like
for the world, really.
For the world, because they had already conquered England. It was truly a remarkable thing when first it was the moment that really marked for the Beatles is they were on the most visible and popular British television show. And it just overnight just ignited Beatlemania in England. And then they were given the opportunity to do the Royal Command performance before, the more high influential folks and just, society of Britain, and there was this moment where I think it was John who said, for those of you who have, for those of you who have chains, you can just shake them, and the rest of you can just clap or something like that. It was something witty and funny that caused laughter in the audience. And once again, the band's ability to relate to any segment of society, whether it's the concert goers and the local Liverpoolians at the Cavern Club to the highest, cultured in England. But that Command performance just took the Beatles to a whole nother level. And then from there, it was just a matter of time before they would, okay, we've got England. The natural next step, of course, is the America.
Yeah, I think the quote was similar to, and I'm terrible with remembering quotes, but I'm paraphrasing. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
For those of you in the cheap seats, rattle your change. And
yes.
For the rest of you, just rattle your jewelry.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was exactly, you did much better with the cheap seats. That's what it was. Good job. But that just made the Beatles just all the more appealing because they were really, they were having fun with the culture, but they were doing it in such a witty way that, wow, these guys are so charming and so relatable.
Then they hop on an airplane and invade the Americas.
Yeah, and they land, of course, in the airport, and of course, the whole throng of multitude is waiting for them, and they truly
turns out it's Weird Al.
And the guys actually thought that maybe the president was landing at the same time. They weren't expecting, the multitude to be greeting them at the airport, but here they are, Beatlemania in England, and you come to the States, and before they even stepped on terra firma here in America, they were the nation's most popular band and recording act in the entire country.
Yeah, and then those amazing TV performances with Ed Sullivan just kind of put it all on the map, right in everybody's living rooms.
Yeah, it changed the life of so many people. So many individuals watched it, and if they weren't watching it from their TV, they were watching it somewhere else. Billy Joel said he was watching it at a friend's house because they didn't have TV in their home. But he was amongst that generation watching the Beatles performing and doing doing what they did best, which was playing the songs that were defining them already. And what's interesting is too, just the UK market and the American market as far as the way the succession of albums came. The box set you bought, of course, was all the British recordings, but in America, things were done a little bit more differently as far as the way the songs were issued, not necessarily in the correct order, as John would remark years later. The UK albums certainly followed more of the progression of the band as far as the timeliness of the recordings, but they certainly they churned them out.
It was nonstop studio work, and that's kind of where they started getting to the point where they were really familiar with the studio and getting comfortable with George Martin and just churning out those hits one after the other.
And as we were talking about, the performances on Ed Sullivan, of course, it can't be overstated that as the band's image began to, develop and their visibility and identity was already, a common happening just because of their music, some very smart individual in the music industry or within the Beatles circle thought it would be a good idea to put the Beatles in a film. And hence the brainstorm of what became one of the more celebrated musical films of its time and has certainly held its staying power now over, a generation or two. And of course, that would be the movie A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, with one of the most interesting guitar chords ever strummed on a guitar.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a very comical and interesting way to put a movie together, throw in a little comedy. Wish the Beatles were all about comedy throughout their lives.
Yeah.
They just loved comedy. The comedy aspect, and bringing that into a movie was just kind of natural for them. And then to bring their own relatable experiences into the movie was just genius, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Like when the journalist asked Ringo, are you a rocker or a modder? He's like, I'm a mucker. Like, that's just awesome, I mean, that's just exactly. But I mean, just the image of that, as you said, first that incredible guitar riff. Bing. I mean, and then boom, here it comes. They're running onto the screen, and what's following them? Of course, the hysteria. And it depicts what the Beatles were really in real life experiencing, that they were running for their lives from this incredible generation of young people, and young girls especially, that just couldn't get enough of the boys from Liverpool.
And then the one part where you see George running down the street, and then he falls flat face onto concrete, and nobody ever talks about that. And I don't know if he was ever asked if he injured himself, because it looked like it hurt.
Yeah. The pitfalls of acting. Sometimes, is it art imitating life or life imitating art?
Who knows? Now, that movie did not fall on its face, I don't think, but some later movies did, maybe.
Yeah, Magical Mystery Tour on television didn't do very, very well.
No.
The critics eternally panned that one, and that was like the first moment where the Beatles didn't seem to be unshakable and, and perfect per se,
Yep, might have sparked them, all four of them, thinking about life after the Beatles.
Yeah. Well, and I love even in A Hard Day's Night when, they were asking about, the possible future, and, John Lennon said, yeah, we could be all, big and lofty and say it could last 10 years, but we're lucky if it could last 3 months, and I think it was 3 months was what he said, but it was, it was that whole thing that, or I think as George says, until we eventually flop, Which, the Beatles never rarely flopped. I mean, Magical Mystery Tour as a TV special and movie didn't go over well, but most of everything that they did in terms of movies, recordings, it rarely ever flopped, because there was this respect for the creative side of who they were individually and as a band. And we talked about how over time, each one of them emerged in their own way. Paul kind of taking on more of the creative, theatrical, classical, more, kind of avant-garde, maybe style of music, but still rock and roll, where, John stayed true, definitely more to his rock and roll soul, felt more of that Chuck Berry, rock and roll music element. George certainly, finding inspiration, through the music of India and the sitar and that
more spiritual side. And then
right. Ringo just recognizing that, hey, I'm just a rock and roller, I can do anything. I can do something as classic as You're 16 when he did solo, or something unique as in It Don't Come Easy. I mean, he could do anything. And I think that speaks volumes, because when he did all those all-star band tours, he gathered the best of musicians, and he just gave you a great rock and roll show. He had no limitations on what he was willing to put out there.
No, and that's what he was used to. He was used to playing with the best in the business. So from back in the Beatle days, to the all-star band. Even now, he only plays with the best because that's what he loves to do. And, George formed his mega band, Traveling Wilburys. So he was also used to playing with the best in the business.
Yeah. And of course, one day we can devote a little time. I think one of our show ideas is some of the super groups. But I love the Traveling Wilburys because it just started out as George, writing a song that was going to be for a proposed future album, and then he just started getting the idea of inviting a player or two, and then it just grew into this thing where you got 5 guys, all incredibly talented in their own right, coming together and forming one of the great super groups. And I love the documentary that's still out there on YouTube that tells that story. And yeah, I mean,
yeah, I don't want to get off the rails too much, but I was talking to my daughter about them because we're both big super fans in our household of the Traveling Wilburys and pretty much all the members in them. And we were laughing at all the nicknames they gave themselves. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Oh, yeah.
So you had George. He went by Nelson Wilbury. And then later on went by Spike Wilbury. And then Jeff Lynne of ELO, he went by Otis Wilbury and Clayton. And then Tom Petty was Charlie T. Wilbury Jr. And then Muddy Wilbury. And Bobby Dylan, he was Lucky. And then Boo. And good old Roy was Lefty. And then didn't get a second name. And it was good music, too. And it was a whole bunch of different styles coming together, working together. But we could talk about that in more detail later, because I think that deserves its own segment, I think.
Oh, it sure does. It absolutely does. But yeah, but it speaks again of George Harrison's talent. Because I mean, when he was given the material for the previous solo album Cloud 9, it was like a rebirth of George back into the mainstream. He hadn't really had anything popular on the charts. The last real chart success he had was, the tribute song to John Lennon all those years ago. He had recorded some stuff in the early 80s that had a little bit of radio airplay, but nothing that made you say, okay, that was a big hit for George. And then Cloud 9 comes out of nowhere, and next thing you know, you've got George, in a whole new phase of life where he's, the silent Beatle is now becoming, the most noticeable Beatle.
Yeah, and I think in the early 80s, George was kind of focusing on film production. He was working on a lot of British comedies, Monty Python-esque types of films, and got into the film production and even started his own production company, which the name escapes me now. But I just watched a good documentary about that, which I'll have to refer to that also in the show notes so people can look that up too, because it's interesting to look into not just music, but the film interest and the comedy aspect that George was also involved in. And then if we talk about Ringo again, you have to talk about Caveman.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a cult favorite, I think. Some people might know what that is.
Yeah. No, yeah. Ringo definitely jumped into the 1980s head first and decided that, he was gonna explore more than just music.
Yeah, and I looked it up. George Harrison's film production company was called Handmade Films.
Handmade Films.
Handmade
nice.
Films started in '78, and then that was actually started up by him to finance Monty Python's Life of Brian, which he was really good friends with a few members of Monty Python, maybe all of them, I don't know. But yeah, that's how that started. But I will link that in the comments so people can look that up. It's really good, interesting to watch.
You know what I have to say about Monty Python? No one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
There's so many quotes from that. We could go on for days.
Right.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Monty Python back in the day. A lot of British things. Doctor Who, Monty Python, Benny Hill. You couldn't stop me with my British comedy. Well, Doctor Who wasn't a comedy, but I guess if you look at the production quality, maybe it was a comedy.
Yeah. Ben, and it was appropriate that Benny Hill was always shown, at least at our market, late at night, usually on the VHF station, because it was always that program that would want to watch at night, because you could hide yourself from your parents and the world, because it was the kind of naughty British comedy that you would want to watch in the dark, because it just to tell people you watch Benny Hill.
Yeah, there was a lot of adult humor, but funny thing is, and I don't know how old we were back when that was playing. I would imagine preteens.
Yeah, it
but
was.
I was watching those with my grandmother, so I wasn't hiding.
Right?
She was watching with me. We loved our comedy back then, which is why I think it's interesting the Beatles also were fully into comedy, and
yeah,
it just kept them not getting too serious about their musicianship, and staying true to the art of making music.
Yeah. Now, a little 6 stages of separation moment that we can talk about, since we're mentioning Benny Hill.
Yeah.
The Beatles and Phil Collins had some moment of relatability within A Hard Day's Night. I think Phil was like an extra in the film.
Okay.
And then years later, he talked about meeting Paul and not having necessarily, allegedly, the most, warm interaction with him. But then later on, when Genesis did the Invincible Touch album, their song Anything She Wants and the video included Benny Hill. And Benny Hill was the guy who was supposed to make sure that none of the outside concert goers got into the band's, green room, and make sure that they don't eat all the food and create all the mess. And of course, he's this, security guy who's on duty, and I got this in. And of course, one by one, they're being filtered in, and by the time you get to the end of the video, the whole room is filled with all the fans eating all the food. And Benny Hill now has to usher them all out, and he has to do a full screen reversal where he puts all the food back in its proper place. How he did it, I don't know, but by the time the band opens the door at the end of the video, he's got his hand holding the cake down. And everything is totally tidy. But yeah, the 6 stages of Kevin Bacon's separation between the Beatles and Benny Hill.
Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks of the week.
New segment, Top Tracks of the Week. This is where I personally hand select my favorite songs of the week. As you know, typically songs are released on Fridays, so I'm going to choose from the pool of song releases and album releases from the previous Friday. As you know, we release shows on Thursdays, so it's basically a week behind, but who cares, really? So I'm going to start off with my first song, and I've picked 10 songs this week, so my first of 10 songs is a song called Needy by Marissa and the Moths. So if you like powerful female singers and mixed with raw, heavy instruments and emotional lyrics, then this whole entire album, which is called Live in the Studio, is full of goodies. It's a good one. And everything's live. Who would have guessed by the name of the album? Next up is a song called Cinnamon by Merpire. I believe that's how you pronounce it. That's from her latest album called Milk Pool. And that song is actually about smells connecting memories. So cinnamon being a strong smell can bring up and conjure memories that coincide with the smell of cinnamon. It's a good one. The album's great. A lot of singer-songwriter action going on in that one. Next up is a song called 10 of 12 by Galpa. That's a Swedish band, by the way. And I hope I'm pronouncing my Icelandic version of Galpa correctly. But 10 of 12 is inspired by the concept of the rooster being the 10th animal in the Chinese calendar. And I personally think that the band's sound seems to be inspired by a mix of Bjork lead singer, sounding a bit like Bjork, and the band Tool. Have a listen. You're going to find quite a few gems in this one. Next up, one of my favorites, and probably my favorite of the week, is a song called Goodbye by Kaidi Akanibi. He's from London, and he does everything. He's obviously sings, he's a saxophonist, guitarist, and a all-round composer. He's basically uncategorizable. He definitely my top pick of the week. And believe it or not, he's in the middle of a personal challenge to release, believe it or not, and get this 7 albums in a single year. 7 albums in a single year. Trying to make Prince seem like an amateur. It's got and this is his debut album, but the whole album's amazing. There isn't a bad song on it. A lot of experimentation going on. Do yourself a favor if you don't listen to anything else aside from this album off of this list. It's okay, but give the song Goodbye by Kaidi Akanibi a chance, and the rest of the songs on the album. Next up is a song called Philanthropist by Jesse Wells, who is kind of a singer-songwriter protest artist. And this particular song is featuring Billy Strings. I kind of classify him as a mixture of John Prine and Dylan. A lot of good songs on there. Very unique voice, very unique approach to songwriting. Next up is a out-of-the-box kind of band for me. It's a song called Professionals, and the band's Big Special. And I categorize them as post-punk. And they consider themselves neither big nor special, even though the name is Big Special. So next up is a rap artist called Lareezy, and a song called Baby, which is kind of a innocent song. A lot of good intention to that song, good meaning, and it's a nice ditty to listen to in the car while you're driving around. And he says on his Instagram that he's using rap to bring peace and love to the minds. Next up, I have another singer-songwriter by the name of Katie Gregson MacLeod, and she's from the Highlands of Scotland, and my favorite song by her this week is I Just Think of It All the Time. It's a very good song. Whole album's great, so give that one a listen too. And then I'm going to go a little instrumental here on the last two. I have a song called Green Lane by Johnny Nash. Not that Johnny Nash, different Johnny Nash, no H. He's widely regarded as one of the most distinctive musical voices on ambient and new age music. And I think that if you are a fan of the artist C418, who does a lot of music for the video game Minecraft, which is very popular, then this entire album's for you. And then probably my second favorite album of the week and my second favorite song of the week is called If Not Now by Rival Consoles. Rival Consoles is an electronic musician from England who creates driving experimental dance tracks, but with a twist. He uses primarily analog equipment and instruments. So that's a very unique approach to creating dance music with analog instruments. So there's my top 10 of the week, and give them all a listen and let me know what you think in the comments.
Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks. Top tracks of the week.
So when we're talking about Sgt. Pepper as far as the songs go, I mean, it obviously starts out with, this little orchestral, little piece that leads into the soaring title track, and that alone was, very innovative. And then from there, we hear the sound of what we learned later on was actually the sound of a crowd from a Beatles concert that leads into the introduction of Billy Shears. And of course,
I think it was more enthusiastic than that. That was kind of lackluster. But
that was Billy Shears at the 25th anniversary in the Cavern Club.
Yeah, exactly.
showing people that he can still rock and roll and, you know, and not die on stage. But yeah, but you know, and of course for the conspiracy theorists, you know, out there that believe Paul died before Sgt. Pepper, they believe that, you know, the guy who replaced Paul McCartney was actually William Shears, and thus the name Billy Shears was ushering in the new era of the Beatles. But of course, you know, we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracies, but that certainly was a very interesting point of discussion for fans of the Beatles at the time. But yeah, but the tracks of Sgt. Pepper, Sgt. Pepper Lonely Heart Club Band, Little Help from My Friends, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, She's Leaving Home, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And I love the story of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. It was literally a billboard, like some type of a poster that had all that writing. And John saw it and decided, hey, this is the perfect song to create based on a poster that said Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And, you know, and of course,
it's amazing what people are inspired by.
Yeah. And, you know, and the incorporation of all the cool effects and just the musical infusions that they did in that song. It was very exploratory.
Yeah, I think they were just using that album as a whole. You know, the songwriting, for one thing, was great, but in the studio work inside, I think they were all getting used to the equipment, just trying to see what all the equipment could do back then, because I think prior to that album, and I don't know exactly what album they introduced the newer equipment, but they used to only have 2 tracks to work with. So they didn't have much to work with, and they were just now getting into the 4-track, so they could do a whole lot more experimenting. And that's why they have all the overdubs and the applause and working all that stuff in. And it's interesting to see that album take shape.
Absolutely. And then second side, Within Without You, When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, Good Morning, Good Morning. And of course the reprise, which is a fabulous reprise. And then leading into A Day in the Life, which is, wow, what a wild song to come up with. And I love Billy Joel's breakdown of it. You know, he's talking about it on his own Sirius XM satellite channel, and, you know, just the elements of it, and, you know, just a wild song, something for its time. Again, very groundbreaking. Nobody was making music like this in 1967. Nobody.
No. And I love playing that song all the way to the end with headphones on. You got to have headphones, and just cranking that volume up after the long crescendo of the piano. You just turn it up all the way at the end, and you could hear somebody's chair squeaking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
All those little intricacies that make you a Beatles nerd, I guess.
Yeah.
Got to listen to that song all the way through, and just the lyrics and the meaning to everything. That's definitely a Beatles classic song. Got to be in the top 5 at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just the lyrics are just like, wow, you know, and the parts of it too, because, you know, first it's I read the news today, then it's, you know, then it's Paul's little segue, woke up, got out of bed, you know, and then this, you know, just kind of way out into, you know, this, and then back to John. It was just all these movements, like movements in a classical piece that just.
Yeah, and that's not something I don't think you could sit at home and write down. Well, I want the song to start this way, and then I want Paul to go off on a tangent this way, and then come back to what it was. I think you got to be able to sit in the studio and have all those tools at your discretion to figure out how that all comes together, and sometimes it just falls together.
You know, it's almost like you've got to be in the studio to see how such ideas take shape, because you can have it here.
Yeah, so if I think you watched that the latest Beatles documentary, Get Back, the Peter Jackson documentary, it shows a lot of the Beatles sitting around in the studio waiting for the other Beatles to show up so they could start recording, and just in that time alone, you know, they're writing songs, just sitting on the piano, just messing around, and things just come up. So sometimes you can write a song and sit there and plan it out, and sometimes it just comes to you in the moment, and just in being in the studio with other members, things just come together.
And that's really what I think made the Beatles, ultimately a great band, because, whether it was their younger years or their more advanced years, the studio became a great friend of theirs. And, and despite an album like the White Album, which was a bit fragmented and a bit kind of all over the place, you still had some really, really significant moments, within that album. I mean, it was two sides. There was a lot of interesting songs. I think the Beatles started to demonstrate their individual versatility on that album more than any other album previously, because you had a song like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which George Harrison showcased an incredible musical sensibility. And of course, he brought Eric Clapton in to, lay the guitar work down. Then you've got Paul McCartney writing this amazing little song called Blackbird, which, had symbolic meaning above the lyrics. It was speaking of something that was paying homage to civil rights and liberation and freedom. Then you had, Ringo certainly, dabbling in there and trying different things. And you certainly had John in there. I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head in the White Album that was kind of uniquely John, but he was certainly
Everybody's got something to hide except for me and my monkey.
Right. All right. Yeah, that was most definitely.
You're starting to see in the songwriting and hear in the songwriting that, Yoko's making a influence in his songwriting as well. Yeah, which is interesting because I think at the beginning of the Beatles, he seemed to be the stronger, appearance-wise, the stronger of the Beatles as far as personality, because, he was outgoing at the time.
Yes.
And then as time went on, I think Paul took the forefront, especially musically. Like, he was singing more songs as time went on, and his, songs were a lot more boisterous, and his voice stood out, and his bass playing was great. And John seemed to almost take a backseat to Paul, even though it was, songwriting was 50-50 on paper. But then around this time of the White Album, John seemed to come back around, putting himself back out there again. It seemed like for a while he maybe lost his place and started to come back, and I think he got that itch, and Yoko may or may not have helped him with that, and then slowly started to grow into his own thing, and eventually led to him exiting the Beatles with everyone else.
Yeah, and I don't think it can be overstated, regardless how Beatle fanatics and fans and enthusiasts feel about Yoko Ono as a person or an artist or a human being. We certainly know from firsthand experience in our own lives, when we have a support system in place emotionally, when we have a companion and a helpmeet and somebody to support us and remind us who we are and cheer us on into battle and to take on the tasks and the challenges of life, to dream big, to think outside the box, to be leaders, to be, I mean, it can't be overstated enough that it changes us. It makes us the men that we're meant to be. And I think what you said there about Yoko, I think that really is where John was transitioning, because, one marriage was ending, a relationship was beginning. John was starting to find his focus, find his eternal creative muse. And Yoko, I think, kind of served as a catalyst for that. And it gave John fresh inspiration and expression to what he had in his musical soul. Regardless how we feel about, Yoko's own musicianship, John definitely, I think it's safe to say, was in a period of rediscovery, per se. And I think that was reflected in the music that he put forth on the White Album and put forth in songs like All You Need Is Love. I mean, arguably one of his finest hours. I mean, it really defined, I think, who he was, what he believed, his idealism, and of course reflected many years later in his solo work. Years later in his solo work. I mean, regardless what you may feel philosophically or spiritually about the concepts of Imagine, it is an extension again of John's own musical soul and ideas of life and what he believed life was or could be.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you're good friends with somebody for so long and somebody else seemingly swoops in and takes that person's life over, you get a little offended, but maybe the other Beatles felt that way. I don't know. I think the fans felt that way more than the other Beatle members did. I think they felt more ownership to John and didn't want him to change and blamed everything on Yoko. But who knows? And I think the Beatles were, with the White Album, they were trying, like with Sgt. Pepper, they were trying to, learn the technology and the equipment and how to work in a studio. And then I think with the White Album, they were learning how to advance themselves as musicians and songwriters, like you said. And then when they get on later to Let It Be and Abbey Road, they're trying to put all that back together again, trying to work together as a band instead of individuals again.
Yeah, and it seemed like early on, based on the Get Back documentary, early on there was optimism, and then things kind of went off the rails pretty fast, and it just became this long drudgery of internal conflict and bickering and disagreements and egos and control and posturing and just all of the ugly things that do start showing up in a band that's forging individuality within the dynamic and finding a way to somehow hone that and temper that isn't easy, even for a good producer like George Martin. It kind of became, sadly, a lost cause. And while the final product is admittedly still good, it ultimately became good through the production process, regardless whether we liked what Phil Spector did to the album or not, or whether we prefer the naked version of Let It Be better. The content, the songs, the music, the gift, the cohesion, the talent, it was there. It was there. It just was, unfortunately, just kind of buried under all of the drama.
Yeah, and George Martin has been quoted to say that he was gonna walk away from it. He wasn't gonna do that last album unless they agreed to do it like they used to do it back in the old days. Just get together and write together and get along with each other and stop. No more goofing around is basically what he said.
Yeah. I think I remember from the Complete Beatles, he's like, Paul came to me surprisingly and said, I would really like to, make music like we used to in the old days. And George Martin said, well, we can if you let me.
Yep.
And that really was, what, piggybacking on what you said. George is like, okay, if we're going to do this, we need to, to grow up, put on your big boy pants, check your ego at the door, and go back to doing what made you who you are and who you still are, a band. And I think despite the fact that both sides of Abbey Road are very much an individual reflection of Paul and John in terms of their own kind of musical style, but still within the framework of the band, you still have a band that sounds like a collaborative band playing together. And I really think it's a reflection of some of their better work, as far as songs.
Yeah. Everybody left the studio and went home, and Ringo quit at one point and he came back, and then George went home for several days and had to be talked back into the studio.
Yeah.
But they eventually came back together and, finished it up and had that, I don't know if we passed over the rooftop concert, but that,
yes, we did pass over the rooftop concert.
Visually, that made it look like everything was working just fine, but behind the scenes really wasn't. And even that rooftop concert to get to that point was a challenge in itself.
Logistically, absolutely. But yet, when you watch that concert, you really see four guys who, despite everything that was going on at the time, relationally and all the friction, it was like, I think deep down, every one of them knew they needed that. they needed that for that moment to be able to be free and to just play. And I mean, you could see it in their faces. It wasn't pure liberation, but there definitely was an obvious, dynamic there that was like, okay, you guys are sounding really, really good. And of course, Billy Preston's back there playing the organ, and of course he brought kind of a fresh element into the band for the short time he was hanging out with them, because they knew Billy from many years ago, and he came in, and that whole guitar, that whole organ piano solo was his. He created that in that song, and that was his contribution, and a big one to the Beatles catalog.
And imagine if he was a band member officially, and early on in their career, he could have sent them in a whole another direction, because he had the finger chops. He could play that keyboard.
He definitely did, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think it would have been a perfect compliment to both Paul and John, because each one of them in their own way, had that side, that musical side where they both loved that kind of style of R&B infused music, which Billy Preston was really a part of that wonderfully talented generation of performers and singers.
Yeah, so the Beatles get into a whole bunch of legal jargon eventually, and then they all walk away.
Yeah, which of course that was that was part of the idea that they had explored and put into place with Apple Corps, that they wanted to, partner with, aspiring musicians and artists to be able to come and record and have, free opportunity to do those things. And I think that was a really, on paper it sounded like a good idea, but I think it was a good reflection of the kind of guys that the Beatles were as humans. They realized that they had experienced so much success, and so much had been lavished on them in terms of adulation, praise, recognition, stardom. It was almost like in their hearts they wanted to give something back to the artistic community. They wanted to do something out of, yes, business related, but something that could ultimately benefit a wider community of aspiring musicians. And I mean, James Taylor was a part for a short time. He recorded there. Badfinger was, of course, one of the bands that was an early part of the Apple Corp label. So, I mean, the Beatles were able to bring in some really, really talented musicians to, record under their business model. So we're talking about, the album, the rooftop concert, and ultimately Apple Corps, and the situation that was happening within the dynamic of that business. It was faltering. It was on the rocks. I think I remember in the Beatles, the complete Beatles, Malcolm McDowell picked up the story and said, meanwhile, things were not looking good back at Apple. And he said, the company was a bit of a mess. It was in the midst of all kinds of unfinished projects and different things. And one of the guys said, if we keep this up, we'll be broke in 6 months. So it was marking a time where business-wise, the Beatles were kind of feeling it, and creatively, I think they were feeling it too. And I think each one of them were really, really in their heart of hearts wanting to break out and do something different. And there's a lot of discussion and theory about who ultimately brought on the breakup. Was it Paul? Was it John? Was it collectively decided? History-wise,
I think everybody just knew. Everybody felt it. I don't think you could point a finger at one person.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Because, I mean, John certainly let his feelings known on the Plastic Ono album. I mean, if there was ever an album of rage and anger and just very much, just hard, heavy sentiments of what he felt about the whole thing, it was,
But in the moment, that sounds like someone's pointing a finger, and we have the luxury of looking at these documentaries and seeing kind of what happened.
Yeah.
But we still don't really know what happened, and we do know that it just happened over time. It started to fall apart, and we know things were said way before the Plastic Ono band.
Yeah, absolutely.
So stuff happened behind the scenes that nobody really knows.
Yeah. And I mean, fortunately, over time, in the subsequent years that followed, Paul and John were kind of able to pick up the pieces and kind of restore a bit of their, relationship to the point where they were hanging out together and still, sharing a little bit of life. That famous Saturday Night Live moment where Lorne Michaels offered the Beatles a sum of money to come and perform. John and Paul were apparently hanging out together at John's apartment at the Dakota in New York City, and they were, for a brief moment, seriously considering taking up Lorne Michaels' invitation and getting back together on Saturday Night Live, which would have been a crazy moment.
What was that, like a check for $700 or something ridiculous?
And then George came the next week and wanted the check, and Lorne had to say tongue in cheek, "But George, look," which I think George was doing that deliberately to be funny and comical. Right. I don't think he literally wanted the $700, but it was very funny that he took advantage of that moment and made light of it. So it was great. Right. But the breakup of the Beatles was inevitable, and they were able to go off and do their own thing, and each one of them found, their own musical expression. Paul certainly, started with his solo album and then morphed into the band Wings, and then a career that to this day, I mean, he's still out there doing it. And Ringo too. George was, more of the hesitant, performer. I mean, when he did that tour back in 1991, that was the last time he went on tour in any form. But I mean, each one of the Beatles, continued to express themselves musically in very profound ways. And, through the anthology segment where, Paul, John's demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love, were able to be recorded along with the surviving members. And then, of course, the recent AI effort Now and Again, you get the chance to see what could have been had the Beatles had another opportunity to get together and just record an album. That would have been quite a thing to hear.
Yep. Well, the documentaries and the albums and the CDs and everything will keep us going for years to come. I think we have enough material to reminisce and keep the Beatles alive forever, because I don't think they'll ever go away.
No, and that's a good thing, because with their constant influence is felt every day. Because anytime anybody picks up a bass guitar, a lead guitar, wants to play the drums, wants to sing, they have a body of work to draw on that they can be inspired by.
Well, I think that about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed it, Tony, as much as I did.
I always enjoy it, my friend. I always enjoy it.
Yeah, well, until next time, for Mr. Wonderful, Tony Nacella, I'm John Nelson. We'll see you on side 2.
See you then.
That's a wrap.